welcome back to this series that covers 11 questions for commercial landscape estimators. My name is Michelle Penz, the Purple Squirrel Consultant, and after deciding to retire in 2022, I discovered that there was little to no modern training for commercial landscape estimators. So I wrote a book called An Introduction to Commercial Landscape Estimating. It's available on Amazon for $19.99, and you will find a link for the book down in the description. This is the 9th of 11 videos that are posted weekly. In this week's video, we are going to talk about contract management. I know that's a very exciting subject, and I think it's it's a task that doesn't often get the attention that it deserves. As estimators, it is our job to take often ambiguous plans and specifications and turn them into concrete proposals and contracts. The success of a project depends on how well the contract is written and frankly how concrete it is. If everything is spelled out, then everybody understands what's going to take place. The first thing that we want to consider is scope review. So when a project is awarded, I strongly recommend that if the general contractor doesn't offer to do so, that you suggest doing a scope review. So you're going to go over the entire scope of the project. You'll want to use your takeoff rendering for that. And of course, you want to go over your proposal with all of the qualifications and the exclusions. I would recommend that you try to get the contractor to include those two items in the contract. Often large contractors won't do that, but it's always worth a try. The other things that you want to consider are plan dates. You want to make sure that the plan dates match up, because often the plan dates will change in between the time you bid on the proposal and the contract date, or I'm sorry, the time when the contract is awarded. So you just want to confirm that you're working from the correct plans and everybody agrees on that. The other thing that you might want to consider is discussing the labor rate, just to double check and make sure that that labor rate hasn't changed, because just like the plans change in between the bid and the contract award, the labor rate changes sometimes as well, because the financing changes. If the government is involved at all, the labor rate may change and you might have to pay prevailing wages. The next thing you want to consider are exclusions, and I would emphasize those. Yes, they're in your proposal qualifications, but a lot of times those contractors, the general contractors, really kind of gloss over them and don't pay close attention to them. So you want to point them out, especially when you have big ticket items like soil, biossoil for detention ponds, for instance, or even just providing soil in parking lot islands. Another good example is park equipment like benches and waste receptacles. If you're not providing those, you want to make it very clear and make sure that the general contractor understands that. Sometimes we only provided labor for the installation of those items, and again, that must be clearly spelled out. And when it comes to park equipment specifically, you really want to boil down to who's going to order it, who's going to accept delivery, where is it going to be staged, who's going to assemble it, and then finally, how is it going to be attached to the surface. Sometimes it's just bolted to the concrete, and other times those items require concrete footings. So all of that needs to be spelled out to avoid any confusion. Contract amounts, that's another thing to consider. It seems obvious, but often throughout the negotiations of a contract, numbers are thrown back and forth. So you want to make very sure that you both agree that that final contract amount, or amounts, if you have multiple proposals, is what everybody agrees on. And the other thing worth mentioning now is that when you finally get the contract and you review it, add those numbers up. Sometimes things get lost in the translation between the person who negotiated the contract and the person who is preparing the contract. So it doesn't hurt. Don't assume they're correct. Mistakes happen all the time. Add those numbers up and make sure they're correct. The next thing to consider are warranties. Generally, most landscape companies offer a 1-year warranty on their plant material, but sometimes the specifications require 2-year warranties. So make sure that that's covered and everybody has a clear expectation of what the warranties cover. Another thing to consider are warranties from your vendors. So for instance, paving vendors, for public contracts, they often require what's called attic stock, which is extra material that's held, it's purchased and kept aside for future repairs. And so that's something you consider along with the warranties from the vendors. Those all need to be considered and make sure that everybody is clear on that. Another thing to consider is insurance. Your company will typically have standard insurance amounts. And for most contracts, most projects, that is more than enough insurance. However, there are times, and again, if the government is involved or there's some other entity involved, sometimes they require very high insurance. So you have to be very careful about that and make sure that your company, A, can obtain that level of insurance, and B, that they want to. If it's a large project and it's going to be profitable, certainly you want to consider adding that extra insurance. If it's a tiny little project and your company has to pay a lot of extra money for insurance, it's probably not worth doing. And that you would discuss with your supervisor and decide how you're going to approach that. But you just want to be aware, don't take those insurance limits for granted, because often they do change and they're much higher. Another thing to consider is timelines. So, and again, for public projects, this is the most frequent, is the timeline. If it's not met, you can incur damages. You can incur monetary damages. So you want to be very sensitive to that based on when your project is going to be installed, and then any other plant material that might need to be installed after the fact. For instance, spring bulbs. If this project is due to be installed in the spring, but you have to return to plant spring bulbs in the fall, you want to make sure that everybody understands that, because you don't want to accidentally incur any kind of damages, because technically the project wasn't complete because you hadn't installed those spring bulbs. Something else to consider, and again, for large cities, public projects, things like that, are additional permits. For instance, in the city of Chicago, parkway permits are required to plant parkway trees. In fact, you need 2 separate permits from 2 departments in the city of Chicago. One of those permits is pretty expensive. They charge a fee per tree, but you have to make sure you have both of those extra permits, which fall outside the normal permits that your accounting department or whoever is responsible for permits might get. These extra permits need to be accounted for, and the cost needs to be accounted for in the proposal as well. If you fail to get those permits and you plant those trees, that can cause a big problem. The city of Chicago will charge upwards of $10,000 per tree if you don't have those permits. So that's something else to consider. I always look for that on projects for large cities, especially if it's a public project. Another thing to consider are submittals. Now, submittals are not always required. You want to look through the specifications. I highly recommend that if submittals are not required, don't provide them. It really protects everybody, because if submittals are required, then you are on the hook for providing exactly what those specifications require, and then you have to document it and prove that you provided that exact thing. Good example is mulch. Most landscape contractors provide their standard mulch, which in 99% of the cases works just fine. But if you have a project that requires submittals and the architect called for specific mulch and doesn't want to make an exception, now you have to provide documentation, usually samples of that special mulch. And of course, that's an extra cost, because you're going to have to go get that from whatever vendor provides that mulch. So submittals are important to consider. The other thing is the timing of submittals. Just like planting bulbs, spring bulbs in the fall, you want to be sensitive to when submittals are required. A good example are perennials. If they want the submittals for perennials in, say, April, all they're going to get are photos of pots of dirt because the summer perennials haven't emerged yet. And likewise, trees and shrubs haven't leafed out yet. So again, you want to be sensitive to that and just bring that up during the contract review or the scope review that, hey, we need to make sure that our submittals really aren't going to be expected until, say, May. Now, and that could create a rub, or even June, because if they plan to start the landscaping early, something is going to have to give. So they could make an exception. Maybe you could provide default photos, stock photos rather, of the trees and the shrubs that you're going to provide. Change orders. That's another thing to consider. Now, this typically is something that you're going to consider after the contract is awarded and signed and the project begins. However, sometimes extra work needs to be done before the project even starts. For instance, turf restoration in the fall, because that area got messed up. The municipality wants some erosion control, so you're going to put some seed and blanket down before the project even starts. So change orders are a very important part of the contract, and it's important to keep track of those. I recommend that you get those change orders signed before the work begins. Now, if you have a good client, it's okay to make an exception, but you have far less leverage on getting those change orders signed and then paid if you wait until after the work is done. You have more leverage if you do that prior to the work being done. And then finally, contract review. And what I mean by that is after you've had your scope review, the contract is written up, they send it to you. It's not complete until it is signed. And that contract review is so important, and it's often neglected and overlooked. I consider contract review to fall into that revenue category. Remember when we talked about that and prioritizing your workflow where revenue is at the top? And contract review falls in that category. Make time for proper contract review. It's no fun. Nobody likes to do it. But as you do it more and more often, you're going to learn to pick out the parts that are important. For instance, make sure your plan date is in there, all the things we talked about, the numbers add up, and you'll learn to look for that boilerplate language that you'll find in the majority of contracts. And you don't want to completely ignore them, but you can kind of look through it and go, yep, that's the boilerplate stuff. I can move on to the next thing. So you'll learn what to pick out. But that does need to be a priority. Contract management really begins when you create your proposal so that you have a nice concrete proposal, it's well defined, and you create the contract, which is also very concrete, and it continues after the project begins. If you have a nice solid contract, your project will run much more smoothly. You'll easily be able to diffuse any disputes because you're going to go by the contract. So that will really help your project to move smoothly. Thank you for watching this video. Please hit the like, subscribe, and notification buttons if you found value in this. Feel free to ask questions in the comments. I'll be happy to answer them in subsequent videos. And if you're interested in a PDF of this series, go ahead and send me an email at my email address, which is in the description. And please join me for the 10th video. And in that video, we're going to talk about, do you know your company's target projects and client types? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.